So this image is an example of this museumified notion, showing this war canoe as it is inhabited by mannequins who are dressed as people would have been dressed in the day, and but they are frozen in time, frozen in a museum exhibit without any real context. So it gives this notion of, as the objects are to the right in the various glass cases, it's still Indians under glass. And you get very little cultural context. And this is also in the American Museum of Natural History. This is the museumification of people, freezing people in time, rather than getting an understanding of what people are experiencing now and what they aspire to. In some ways, I almost wonder for a while if this was conscious in order to keep people ignorant of the mayhem that nations wreaked in cultural destruction. That if you can show that you preserve something from it, you can absolve yourself of the national guilt of having destroyed peoples, destroyed their languages, and by being able to show the artifacts and the like, and show mannequins, all right, that you preserved something that was going to be vanishing, and yet, while absolving yourself of the role as a nation in the vanishing of those people, which did not occur, but was a way of thinking. So we have to understand that from an anthropological as well as a sociological perspective in the social sciences, that it goes beyond cultural, and I'll elaborate once again in a few moments about cultural Darwinism and social Darwinism and social evolution and the like. That we see that there are distinct organizations that are tied to the climate and geography or an environment, that people's lifestyles are adapted to the environment in which they live. So, and that includes water use patterns, that includes sustenance patterns, such as the types of foods that are harvested, how they're prepared, how they're served. These are all a function of climate, geography, and environment. We see that if there were tribal groups who tended to be more mobile, that they created more small and portable arts and architecture. But this misperception of people being nomads and hunter-gatherers through their whole history, we find out if you lead that type of existence in the Americas, you're actually wasting a lot of calories chasing things down, because there was so much food that was readily available, as well as there was so much arable land. So one of the things we'd find out is that most of the peoples of the Americas were at least horticultural, which meant that they were farming, but they weren't doing plow-style agriculture. They weren't doing industrial agriculture. And they may have had a few domesticated animals, like as turkeys, but also relied on hunting, as compared to having no domestic animals. So they didn't have cattle. They weren't using the plow. And and so when you see these movies, Dances with Wolves, think about this. How sexy is a movie going to be, Dances with Corn? Dances with Wolves sounds a lot better. It reinforces that notion of nomadic, tribal, wild people, rather than settled people who were living in large towns or even cities, as we saw in Mexico, and we'll see even into North America. That we'll see this whole range in the North America that we would have seen in Europe at the time and continue to see in Europe and throughout the world. But when we're looking back from a technocratic society, we have to be careful that we don't see that being more mobile, more portable, and less tied to a given region and not doing plow agriculture does not mean less civil or less advanced in the thinking. Because how advanced, how civil are you when you dirty your own nest, when you poison your own water, when you poison your own air, and you poison your own bodies? How civil is that? So we find also that management of food and surplus is connected with a more sedentary society. So where you see the woman in the upper right doing basketry, you can assume there was a more mobile existence as compared to when you see ceramics. You can assume that it was a less mobile, but people did move around because they traded. Because when you see those turkeys there, how did the turkeys on that Cochiti vessel get there? So But you're not going to be carrying vessels like this any great distance. So it implies then you're living in a more contained area. And it also means you're managing water, because that is a water oya. You also find out that larger scale societies stress more permanent architecture, larger buildings, and more monumental arts. Smaller scale societies have smaller dwellings, and their arts may not be as monumental. They're not designed to stand for hundreds of years. They're not part of state-level organization or state-level memory. So social organization also relates to arts as we would see it in people's subsistence style, their architecture, and many more ways that our culture is comprised. And we also would observe in how museums and social structure and a people's subsistence in a very direct way relates to how much we know about them as collected by museums. One of the reasons that Charles Edenshaw is known, because you'll see he's in the upper right, he's a carver. He's working on a small scale, and he carved in wood and argillite. And argillite is a soft stone that hardens once it's exposed to air for a long period of time, somewhat similar to catlinite, or pipestone from Minnesota. How is it that we know so much about Charles Edenshaw, this Haida artist who lived in the 19th to early 20th century, as well as his wife, Isabella? And you see a weaving by her, and we talked about her, how in social organization and cultural organization and diversity of gender roles in art. He's doing sculpture, she's doing weaving. And he's also painted the design onto the hat that she wove, but he probably assisted her in gathering the spruce root. But we know a lot about him because by this time he was elevated to this role of someone who museums wanted to collect objects from, because he was seen as someone who had this skilled hand, also knew so he knew the media as well as the imagery that was important to his clan. And so his name is known disproportionate to his talent, because there were other people of Edenshaw's generation who were as talented but did not come to the notice of different museum collectors. And so when we're looking at privileged moments as part of art history again, they are two individuals, Charles and Isabella Edenshaw, who were part of these privileged moments when the artistic tradition of basketry weaving and as well as textile weaving transcends Isabella, and the sculpture and the carving and painting tradition transcends Charles Edenshaw into very, very large family crest poles that were carved for families rather than for sale to either a museum or a tourist market. And this is also the impact of intercultural contact. But they were engaged in intercultural trade well before Russians as well as French or English or other European countries encountered them hundreds of years before. But this can affect perceptions of authenticity then, because that small family crest pole that you saw Edenshaw carving, now because he is a noted artist, that would be more valued than what we might see as some works that were carved and created later on. That's still a reflection of that movement of something that was very, very large. These crest poles are huge, whole logs that are stood up with all of the family crest images. And then how do they get from being something so large to being something so small and sold in a different market? Now, in some parts of the world, this would be seen as part of inauthenticity or a reflection of colonialism, and it is a dynamic in that. But it does not denigrate that object's statement of a culture history at a given point in time, and it does not and should not denigrate the excellence with which that work was carved. That it still is carrying culture stories. But we see that clan relationships affect membership in different societies, and that when you have intercultural contact and then you start to have intercultural marriage, it may have weakened clan structures and may have strengthened gene pool. There would be a lot of people that we call Native American or Indians today would not be here had there not been intermarriage between Europeans and American Indians, because there would have been a resistance that was developed to different diseases and the like that would come through intermarriage. And at the same time, though, when we are weakening clan structure, it means that the very term Native American is going to start to change, because you would actually be very hard-pressed to find when someone says, I'm complete, I am full-blood, da-da-da-da, there's a real strong chance that you have some other tribal group as part of your background. And the very fact that you say full-blood shows your mind is colonized, because that is a term that's introduced by the United States to define who you are. Because in earlier time, people define themselves by their tribe and define themselves by clan, not by blood. And at certain parts in history, it was very important and considered a really good thing if you were intermarried with whites, because it gave you access to, as Steve Wall and I like to say, stuff. It gave you access to trade goods that you wouldn't have. So it's important to understand that some of these notions of authenticity, of blood, are introduced through colonialization. That the concept of 4 colors is introduced through colonization. That blood quantum, and whether it be 4th, 16th, half, whatever it is, that usurps clan and tribal affiliation. And when we start to see terms like band, status, reserve, to define First Nations, those are English terms, and they are used for tribes to start to, I would argue, legislate themselves out of existence by who is or who isn't. And then tribe, enrollment, reservation being on the state side. These are all enforced legal terms that are designed to treat people who are culturally, historically, and linguistically different as a homogeneous group, as Native Americans, rather than the various cultural political entities that they are and were. So be aware of those terminologies. It is historical truth that colonization did occur. With this being said, we have to consider then, how did tribal peoples' cosmologies survive through their creativity in the midst of what we might argue are their own holocausts or their own cultural apocalypses? If we understand that cosmologies are systems that we have in place to structure our universe, to understand our universe, and to understand our place in the universe, and that these ideas are expressed through the physical, the tangible, and the intangible things that we create. Once again, the songs, dances, as well as the objects that we create. How did they survive? That we also understand that cosmological beliefs of different people are going to interact with each other. They're going to be forced or voluntary. This means that when people with different cosmologies come into contact with each other, they're going to get each other wet. They're going to trade ideas. Sometimes it will be forced. Sometimes it will not. And when this occurs in anthropology, it's called syncretism, which means that different, you might say, spiritual, religious, or cosmological beliefs encounter each other, and a new set of beliefs emerges as a result of this encounter. In some ways, it's almost unrecognizable from the original mother cultures, we'd say. For example, the Métis culture in Canada, as a result of interaction between northern tribal groups and Europeans, developing their own language, developing their own cultural mores as a result of contact between people from different continents. But how do they survive as peoples? And what is the expression of their cosmology as a result? We're going to be seeing this, the survival, rather than the vanishing of tribal peoples. And how do cosmologies work in place of or alongside of each other in the midst of missionization, forced conversion of religion, or syncretism, that phenomenon that I just described? How are certain spiritual ideas incorporated into existing spiritual ideas so that the original ideas can continue by accommodating the newer ideas rather than trying to obliterate And this is an important part of understanding cosmologies in the Americas, is the willingness to incorporate new understandings, that you don't find the monotheistic, the monolithic view in many societies as you would find in the Europeans, who came with no tolerance for or no acceptance for spiritual beliefs other than their own. So when you have a monotheistic and a monolithic, we'll say, manner of thinking, it tries to obliterate the poly and the many. And how do the people who see the world as plural and see the cosmology as plural, who view the creation of the cosmos as being an interaction from many different beings as compared to the creation of one being, how do we see that people survive? And how do we see expressions of this survival through the works that people create, tangible and intangible? So we see as part of this notion then, and in cosmology, and we will see this throughout the works that we created, or that are created and that we'll look at, is this examination of the natural world, spirit, and survival in art. That the concept of soul or spirit isn't confined to humans in many tribal societies, that the whole world is filled with soul, that it would be, as Yoda would call it, the Force. All beings are spiritual intermediaries, that they aren't just fat little chubby babies with wings. They aren't just angels, all right? That anything can be a spiritual intermediary. Anything can connect you with a greater cosmos or a greater mystery. That places, natural and human constructed, possess spirit. We do shape space, and we do, as cultures, get different symbolism from space. What one culture might see as this vast tundra, another culture might see as an amazing paradise based on their survival skill within it. That there is an interspecies participation in creation that we see in many tribal societies, rather than one God on high. That transformation itself, that things are constantly changing, is central to the cosmology. Things are in a constant state of change, and it can occur, even trans-species kind of transformation can occur. And then people are observing the world, and they're observed by it. In other words, that humans don't exist in the world in a vacuum, that they are interacting with other spiritual entities. We see also, as an overlying and underlying theme throughout the texts that we're using, that dreams and visions, these are intangible things in our brains and in our spirits, then become tangible, visible through the works that we create, the songs that we sing, and the dances that we do. So humans can gain insight from non-humans, from spiritual beings, through these dreamlike states, such as, or liminal states, such as dreams, such as visions and trances, and that our awareness is actually expanded by moving between different layers of the cosmos, then, from the physical realm to the non-physical realm, and that itself is a transformation. And that the journey between these different realms can be assisted by, elaborated on, or remembered by the works that we create. So dreams and visions are going to be an important part. It's not just one individual, in a Michelangelo or a Leonardo da Vinci and his wanting to do dissections in violation of church edict. This is done more for the greater human and tribal cultural good than just the individual aggrandizement, as we often see in other parts of the world. So how is this articulated then? We may see it through shamanism, healing practices, and some anthropologists suggest shamanism is probably the earliest form of religion. And so we see that any substance can have medicine in it, can have spiritual power. That some individuals may have exceptionally strong spiritual power, and how they use that power is going to determine whether they're seen as a benevolent or a malevolent force within that culture. And what we define as witchcraft or malevolence is going to vary from culture to culture. And that the power can be used for healing, hunting, protection, divination. Divination is understanding events, not just predicting the future, but understanding how things have been. And then different societies have different visual iconographies, systems of pictures that depict and recognize power then. So how do we see shamanism as articulated through art?